Hello, everybody. So I've got a few things on Python to go over this evening. We looked at some basic syntax the other day, which is basically what this week's assignment was. Or was the most recent assignment. Still got some other things to go over. And in this class, there's a lot of, especially here at the beginning, there's a lot of the other software development stuff that we normally don't see until side notes later in the other intermediate level classes. So one nice thing about both introduction classes having Python these days. You can count on most people having seen it by this point. So we've got a few things. We talked about it last week, but I can't remember if I explicitly stated it, but we looked at the emoji and TQDM modules last week. Well, every week I have some modules to include like that, something useful. Just that I've found over the years to be very useful. The one for this evening, when I was reviewing, thinking about things this morning, I suddenly realized that would be that's also a really important thing for the ethical hacking class to see. And they are right next door. Well, they're blended class, they're virtual tonight. So I sent a message to them and they might join us around the end. So probably the end of the class. I was like, well, the last 15 minutes, I'm expecting 8:15 to 8:30 to be the last 15 minutes of class. So they will probably join because it's something in Python that will be useful for them. Obviously not the only way to do it, but by far the easiest way to do it. So I guess show them, or at least invite them over if they want to come to that. A few other stuff. There's some people have turned in already. There's some command line instruction assignment this week. Really simple ones, make folders, copy files between folders, very basic things. But if we're going into software development, there's a lot of that other stuff we'll have to do. You'll pretty much never see something written in just one language. So what you would probably think of as sitting down writing a program right now, we'll talk about this more throughout the semester, is kind of insufficient. If you have a Python program that runs, it runs, but is that really enough to call it an application? Like that you would distribute to other people yet? There's some other things. Installers are a big one. Those who've had me before have seen it because there was one thing that was left off of every single programming class I ever took. So I try to make sure I include that. And it's kind of an important thing in the long run. It relates to the command line stuff.
Hey, do you know what the Ogle Hall room is? 191. I'm looking for the ethics class. Said it was 191.
191. The numbers do not go that high.
That's what I thought. That's what.
Is it?
It's ethics.
I can look it up real quick for you.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt your class.
Oh, it's all right. Because last week somebody was looking for an ethics class.
Yeah.
Excuse me for just a second. Let me help him. And they had like room 391. Well, there's only 2 floors here.
Yeah. It says 291 on the syllabus, but I can't find a 291.
So yeah, it is definitely not 291. I can tell you that.
I'm so sorry.
So let me use my laptop and because it has all of my accounts saved. And I will find which room it is for you real quick. Yes, I know some of your classmates were looking for it last week and I wasn't quite sure where to send them.
Yeah.
What is the prefix for ethics? Is that in a philosophy class?
Yes.
PHIL.
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 Yeah. Enzo is the professor.
So PH philosophy
102.
102. At Summersburg. Both of them. Oh, 219. Okay, so 219. It's kind of
Up by the stairs
across the archway, and
yeah,
go all the way to the end and keep going.
Okay.
So like the far corner from here. people were looking for that class last week too. So there might be more than one question if the teacher hasn't corrected it on the syllabus or anything. So where were we? Oh, yes. So command line stuff, do simple ones this week. We'll look at that tonight. Writing on a Windows system, a batch file, on a Linux system, a shell script. On a Mac, there's technically .command file, but nobody uses those. Everybody just writes shell scripts on the Mac. The little things like that will be very important. We'll talk about that later. But we have to do that stuff because if you weren't already familiar with it, anytime we click a button on our computers, what that does is it runs a command from the operating system control language, PowerShell, command prompt, bash, fish, zesh, lots of them, right? As far as the text that we type in. But just like when we're writing programs, the text we type in isn't what actually processes through the CPU, right? It's turned to machine language, so we can use any one we want. There are some standards. Windows usually use PowerShell. It's one of the really nice things Microsoft has ever done. Actually, Linux and Mac both scrapped their plans to make a modern operating system control language after Microsoft made PowerShell, and they just went with PowerShell compatibility. So you can use PowerShell on all the systems. Several forms of Linux now come with that. Kali Linux comes with PowerShell by default. There are some big advantages of it. Well, this is a programming class. The biggest advantages in most of our things like that, bash, the old style command prompt, which doesn't actually do anything on Windows anymore. PowerShell was an update on that, an extension. So all the old command prompt stuff worked, and they tried to get rid of command prompt and people threw all kinds of a fit. So they put command prompt back in, but all it does is forward those commands to PowerShell. Kind of a fake in there, I guess, to make people that have been doing it since the days of DOS happy. But whatever one we're using, I don't need to go down a rabbit hole. We're going to look at some of that. We're going to start looking at those things tonight. I'll step back a second. Well, whatever one we're using is all text, except for PowerShell. And PowerShell returns are always objects. So we don't have text that we have to parse through and then do stuff with. When we get a return back from one of those instructions, it is automatically in the form to go into the next script. And as an object, so we can do the dot stuff like y'all are used to, right? Object dot attribute dot subclass dot method or nested class dot method, all the dots in there. So that's the biggest advantage of it for as far as operating system control language. So that's why you'll see me use PowerShell most often. And when we get up to that thing where we're ready to make installers, like not the pip installers, we'll see that before long, which is segue to the next thing on my list to talk about. The actual installers, the .exe file or MSI or .pkg. I always make a .deb. That's a Debian installer, but Linux users don't use that. They want the source code. Most Linux users just want the source code. But I make one of the Linux installers so that they know I tested the software on a Linux system. Just a little indication that, yes, this was tested on a Linux system. You shouldn't have to modify it afterwards. Or any more than a Linux user.
You say that was DEB to test that for Linux?
DEB. That's what a Debian installer. It's one of the kinds of, it's the equivalent of an MSI installer. So on Windows, once you're familiar with the .exe, that's the installers that have a wizard and you walk step by step through them. And the MSI Microsoft installers, those are the ones where you just start and it runs the whole process and you don't get any options or anything. So a .deb is the Linux equivalent of that MSI, where you just start it and it runs the whole process and deletes itself at the end. It cleans up after itself. We will see that stuff later. There's also the installers like pip or Anaconda or Voila. Those are the three most popular. Pip is the official one. So that's what we're looking at here in the class. The others exist, but there is an official one, so the others have to follow suit from what the official one does, because they can't stray that far from the language. Which is something that showed up in the homework as I graded the week 1 homework. Remember, there are those criteria for the manifest and a bug report. Different ways you can do that, but those are worth 10% each. If you miss those points, I put a comment in the grade book for everybody saying that if you miss that, you can turn it back in and I'll put those points back on there. I definitely, it's an important thing. This class is software development with Python. It's a software development class, not a Python class. We're using Python to learn software development concepts, and manifest is very, very important. And it needs to be something precise. So the first week when it was just a completely blank text file with the name requirements.txt. A couple people did write something in it, just like this is the manifest or whatever, but you can't even do that. It is for an automated process. So a human will never look at that file. So it's something that is feeding into another piece of software. So it needs to be exactly what that software expects. So it has to be there. It'll throw an error. It's going to throw a file not found error if it's not there. And hopefully by this point, y'all are well aware you never want your end user to see an error message, right? We need to deal with that before we get there. Which dealing with that is a fine art form and kind of a talent. Some people are naturally better at it than others. So another thing, I know some of y'all have seen it before in classes, but what textbooks and tutorials usually show for exception handling, we'll see it when we get to that section. The typical thing you'll see in a textbook or any tutorials when you go look it up is the exception handling stops the program from running and spits out a message. But what happens if we don't handle the exception? It stops running and spits out and prints out a message, right? So that's not really handling the exception. It is not uncommon for your exception handling to be larger than the program itself. And hopefully that code will never run. That's the goal, that we never hit that exception. But it's pretty common that the exception handling will be larger because we don't want that. That is the last thing we ever want to happen, is the program to just crash. We want it to keep running. We don't want to just say the program crashed. We want it to keep running and the user to never know that any problem happened along the way. The example we use in class is we'll probably do it on a file not found exception. And our exception handling, we will write the file, which will be longer than the rest of the program that needs to read the file. And seems a bit redundant, but hopefully it's code that will never, ever run. We recreate the file, and that way, the next time it runs, the file has been created. But if something happens, we can recreate it and use it in live time. And then we never crash because we can't find a file. So a little bit more exception handling, but obviously that sort of thing doesn't fit well in a class. So we'll mostly just look at the syntax for it. Also tonight, after we talk about a couple things and command line stuff, a few things there, virtual environments, we'll probably go ahead and start in the class example, just a program, an application that we'll keep coming back to and revamping and improving and building on throughout the semester so that we can see the stuff in action, an actual application of the concepts we're studying instead of just the raw syntax mostly. Won't be a fancy one. Got a couple ideas, but probably a payroll thing, because that's a nice, easy thing that, well, we're Americans. Americans are well aware of how payroll works. We know intuitively when we can complain about our paycheck and stuff, and we can cut a lot of corners. A lot of other full applications we can't really cut corners on. But if I just like choose a random tax rate instead of actually going to irs.gov and grabbing the current tables and figuring out what everybody's tax rate is and doing the full adjustments for things like your tax rate changes throughout the year and all that stuff. if we skip that, that's okay for an example software. Other types of software don't really allow us to cut corners. But we might start putting that together because we might need to fill a bit of space because, like I said, for the useful module I wanted to go over tonight, I'll talk about some of the places I normally use it when we get to it, but it is also something very useful for the ethical hacking class. And since they're right next door, I went ahead, either right next door or on Zoom, I went ahead and invited them over. So they'll probably be here the last 15 minutes of class, which the rough plan was 8:15 to 8:30 on that, which leaves us about an hour, almost an hour and a half of time to do stuff after we talk about stuff. Okay, so that was a good bit of talking. So I guess starting off here is we should probably look at command line stuff. And I'm going to share my screen. And I pulled up, I've been using the Windows terminal. If you're on a Windows machine, you push Windows X and get to all the computer management applications. Windows terminal was something Microsoft released. They did the final, it's been in beta testing for a little while, alpha testing, beta testing, going down the levels, but they finished the testing and actually released it last year. Although other people have been using it, a lot of people have been using it for a couple of years now. It was technically still in beta test, but this is another one of those super nice things Microsoft did. So when you can, I would highly recommend updating to the Windows terminal because we have access to all of them. So PowerShell, command prompt, which again, Windows removed it, or Microsoft removed it, and people threw a fit, so they put it back in. But PowerShell was an extension of command prompt, so all the original command prompt stuff works in PowerShell too. The Azure Cloud Shell, you can do other things with it. These other two machines, I'll talk about those here in just a second because that will be useful for you as well. And under settings, you go in here, and when we control it, it's like the Sublime text editor. The reason I use Sublime text editor because all of the configuration is done in JSON, which if you're a programmer, you're probably going to do a lot of JSON, right? Has everybody seen JSON before? JavaScript object notation. It's kind of like Python in that it's not the best for the machine, but most humans find it the easiest one to work with. Similar to Python dictionaries, if you were to look at some JSON code and a Python dictionary side by side, unless there were functions stored there, you couldn't really tell the difference. And we don't really do a whole lot of functions in JSON anyway. So in general, if you look at them, it looks exactly like a Python dictionary syntax. That's a good form for humans to work with the data, not for the machine to work with data. So just like Python, it's slower when it actually runs, but we're talking nano to milliseconds slower. So it's got to be huge before a human would notice that slower. Okay, so you probably have PowerShell on your machine. You can upgrade to terminal at some point, but any of them will work. We can have access to all of these. The big thing is that it puts them all at once. So another thing I was going to look at is a WSL. I was going to point this out. Y'all will, this is going to pop up messages. Oh, well, that jumped right to my Kali machine. So it is part of the official release now. If you're Windows 10, check your latest update on Windows 10. Right, if you go to Windows X and System, and I think it's in, I thought it was here somewhere. OS build. If your Windows 10 starts with a 20 or bigger, or Windows 11, obviously, you can go to System and then the About System, and on OS build, if it's Windows 10 starts with a 20 or bigger, you can do the full Windows subsystem for Linux. So it's virtual machines built into the thing. Let me go over to PowerShell here. I'll just open the Kali here. Yeah, I didn't set it up this time, but I usually keep it configured so that I can have PowerShell, Kali, and Ubuntu open at the same time in the same tab. You can do cross panes and stuff like that. Maybe if I open another tab, it'll still do that. Open Kali and drag that tab over here. Oh, I have to go in and set it up in the JSON, but can divide up the same one. Terminal's really, really nice. So I would recommend looking into Windows Terminal. And there's some YouTube videos about customizing it that show some great color options, and you have lots and lots and lots of control on how to do that. So this is probably more than we need to do this week, but IP config, a normal networking thing. If you haven't seen that before, a Windows machine, it tells us how we're set up for the network connections. And as I scroll down through here, you'll see all the IP addresses and stuff. And then down here, Ethernet, but those in the classroom, y'all can clearly see it. It might show up on the video. There is definitely not an Ethernet cable plugged up to my laptop right now. Right? But it thinks there is, and it's the WSL. So it creates a network of your Windows machine to a Linux machine. And like, that's what this Kali one is here. So what do I need to do? Script, IP address, join it. There it is. Then INET. Yeah. Grab IP address to INET. Was it one word? Well, can't remember the command I was looking for. IP address. There we go. I was trying to send that somewhere. That was gonna be my example of what the pipe symbol is used for. If I'll just talk about it, grab the numbers you need from here, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But notice the internet address this has. It's hard to see when I highlight it there, but 172.26, some other stuff. Over here in PowerShell, that Ethernet shows 172.96. For those who have had networking with the 2 spots on the subnet. So it is fully networked together. Open Windows, the File Explorer, the Windows E. You see the folders all know about each other. Over here in Kali, if I list out the mounted drives, you'll see the C drive, Windows. The G drive is Google. So I sync to the Google Drive since I constantly use switching back and forth between machines. WSL, so that's my other Windows subsystem for Linux machines. And if you're into software development, well, the reason we're going to look at command prompt or some sort of command line instruction this week. If you're a Linux user, like I know there's at least one Linux user in here already, you don't necessarily have to do the command prompt if you want to use the bash terminal, but cross-platform is good. We need to know that stuff. We're going to make an application, develop a piece of software, which is the path that I believe everybody in here is heading down. You're going to want it to run on Windows machines, Linux machines, Macs, lots of different machines. So you probably want to be familiar with multiple of these systems. You can start it just by going to Windows PowerShell and typing WSSL startup, and that installs a small Ubuntu version that by default. A better way to do that, if you go to the start menu and search for turn Windows features on and off, usually finds it really, really quick. So go to turn Windows features on and off. And you get this little list of, a big long list of checkboxes. And down near the bottom is Windows subsystem for Linux. So if you turn that on, you get the built-in one. If you turn it on that way, then you just when you restart your machine, you'll have the WSL running there. And then you can go.
How'd you pull up that window? I'm sorry.
Search for turn Windows features on or off.
Okay.
So I typed in a T and it found the rest of it. Turn Windows features on and off, and then find Windows subsystem for Linux on there. You might want to make sure you have virtualization enabled. That usually is by default anymore. If not, you have to change that in the BIOS, and BIOS depends on hardware manufacturer, and like you can't even tell. It depends on who made that green board that all the hardware is soldered to. So it is different depending on the system. So like just because I have an HP laptop and can look at the model number, that does not give me enough information to go Google which key press gets me into BIOS. It'll give a short list.
And then we check Windows subsystem for Linux, you said?
Yes.
Okay.
After that, you have to it won't work till you restart your machine though.
Uh-oh. It's doing something, sorry.
Go to Task Manager, you're on a Windows system, and look at the CPU, go to Performance, and then select CPU. It will say whether virtualization is enabled or disabled. That's usually enabled by default anymore. If it's disabled, you have to change it in the BIOS, and you'll have to do some Google searching to figure out how to do that on your machine, because that is specific to who made that, which factory in China made the green plastic that all the other pieces are soldered to. So even Googling it with your model, with your computer model number and stuff, will only get you down to a short list of keyboard presses that it might be to adjust the BIOS. But virtualization is usually enabled by default. And then you can have these virtual machines built in and have have some different systems there to practice with. And it doesn't have to use terminal. So once you install them, like I have the Kali, I think Kali's a Zeech prompt. So I can just open the prompt here by itself without going through the terminal with all the tabs and stuff. But the terminal does nicely put them into one spot. If you got downloaded Git SCM, there is also a bash prompt already configured to run a Windows system, so that you can get some practice using bash, because that's what you're going to use on Linux, and Mac should be Zeech these days. But Zeech is a cousin of bash, and you have to get really, really advanced before you start seeing differences. They're very similar. Well, I guess there's some differences that show up, but you would be familiar with any of that chain of operating system control languages. And same thing, if you're normally a Linux user or a Mac user and you download the Git SCM, you should get a Git command, CMD, so you can get familiar with the Windows commands if you're used to the Linux ones. And then you don't have to do a whole separate thing, because that's the prompt configured for your system. Did I say Git GUI? Git bash. I'm going to say Git GUI a second ago. Sorry. There's a bash prompt configured to run Windows, and there's a command prompt figured to run Linux, so that you can work with other systems.
Hey, Chris, if I use that git command, is it going to do like you said, where on the other Windows command that it's going to send messages back and forth?
Oh, no. that one does go straight to the machine.
Okay, thanks.
If you just want to use command prompt and just not go through PowerShell at all, then that one would do that on a Windows machine. But it's more designed for, so Windows users can test things on bash scripts and Linux users can test things on command prompt. Because we want our software to be cross-platform usually, right? If you leave off a platform, you're alienating a whole bunch of potential customers. And a lot of stuff is very similar. So I'll use the old command prompt terms here. PowerShell updated them to a modern language. We spell everything out. Our selection structures look almost identical to how they look in Python. There's a slight difference. Use curly braces, but not semicolons. Still uses line breaks. So this is that language. That's the modern one. I'll just use the command prompt instructions here. And a similar thing, I guess, in Kali. And show, because most of what we're going to do for this assignment, the starting point, we'll see that more of this throughout, is we just need to do what's called task-oriented programming. It's a lot of that. And that is the tedious, repetitive, sigh heavily when it's time to do that stuff. That's go to some folder and do something when you get there. Location and objective. That's how we're finding it. Like I have a working folder, so I'm going to navigate CD, which this is a big difference. So CD documents/delete, and that got over to the little scratch folder I always use here. Go to this location and then maybe let's make another folder. Make directory, make dir for make a directory, and I'm going to call it scratch because I'm going to delete this one. That's not important. And we say it created it. If I jump over to the Linux machine, it's going to look almost identical to that, which I think this is a brand new Linux machine. Let me check. Yeah. So first off, I need to make that folder. So make directory documents. I'll start here at my home path and make directory documents/delete. Then I have the same, I put that same working structure on all of my machines. So now if I change directory into documents, or sorry, CD into documents/delete, kind of looks like it did the same thing. The big difference, this is one that they use the same abbreviation, but it is different. So if I type CD here, it goes back to the home directory or the starting directory. If I type CD in PowerShell, it stays where it is. So in Windows, CD means current directory. It's also a variable we can use in our code. When we start writing scripts, we can use CD as a variable to get to the current for our current directory. But in Linux, CD is specifically change directory. If we want the current directory, it's PWD, present working directory. Let's print that out. Linux has to have the / backslash is an escape sequence like you're probably used to in Python. Windows is supposed to have the backslash, but it will accept both. And 90% of the situations, 99% of situations, it'll accept both. An escape sequence is the tick mark. It's technically called grave accent. The thing next to the one under the tilde on the keyboard, it's called a grave accent. That's the escape sequence for Windows stuff. Or make directory is the same in both of them. mkdir. Make dir is also a Python instruction, but in Python we also have make dirs. So instead of like I did here in Linux where I made the first one and then made the second one, I say make DIRs and then make the second one, and it'll create every folder it needs along the way to get there. So doing that in Python is nice. So there's a lot of that. Copy, paste. That's kind of what the assignment is for. Has everybody seen a little bit of that before? And it's good to get practice with that. More is always acceptable. You'll see the instructions in there. You just need to set up some directories, create a file, and then copy a different file to copy files between directories, which in Linux is CP. I guess I need to make something. I'll just do this. Echo hello world to scratch.txt. So let's set out, we have that little text file, and then to copy it, and copy is in Linux CP for copy, scratch.txt, and then where do we want to go? I'll call it duplicate.txt. So now ls list out what you're looking at. Linux has some really nice options there. We have ls-l, ls-a, and we get different things. We get different levels of information about it. On Windows, if we want to see what's there, it's dir for directory, dir, list out, and we get all of the same information every time. However, one of the nice things about PowerShell, they included the old command prompt things. They also included a lot of Linux commands. So your most common Linux commands that aren't also command prompt commands like ls will also work here. PowerShell has some nice features to it. Clear works in most of them. If you're on command prompt, I actually want to use the old stock CMD prompt where everything's abbreviated. I'm typing in the abbreviations now. The big advantage, PowerShell is a modern language. So when all the other ones, Bash, well, I guess Bash was actually an update that came later, but when all those operating system control languages, all of them that we will be familiar with have grown from things that were created back in the 1970s. And in the 1970s, RAM was a very precious commodity. We definitely didn't want to waste it on computer experts. So everything was abbreviated. PowerShell has everything spelled out, but they did keep spelled out as full words. So like to create a file, new item, give it a path argument, scratch.txt, item type is a file, value is hello world, and we pass it in. It's a fully spelled out function, and those are parameters and arguments for the function. I actually put the parameter name, but just like in Python, y'all probably seen it before. If we send the arguments in the right order, they'll go to the right parameter. But if we're not sure about the order, we can type the parameter name and specify which one it is. Slightly different syntax. And in the operating system control languages, parentheses mean something very, very specific. So we space delimit our function calls. So PowerShell's like, the PowerShell updates are like that. Everything's spelled out. A really, really, really nice naming convention. So after you work with it for a while, you'll probably just start guessing those. If you're on a Windows machine and PowerShell ISE is actually an IDE that has all the predictive text, help menus, and GUIs to fill in forms and stuff like that. That help menus built right in. And if you want to look at stuff like that, that might be a PowerShell ISE might be a better one to start with, because it's a full, like an IDE, only it's a shell, right? Integrated shell environment instead of development environment, because writing PowerShell scripts, we're doing it to run in an operating system control shell. So we got the new item. Copy is the one for, I think it's copy. Yes. And no matter which one you're using, it's consistent. Control C cancels the command. All of our terminal applications are Control C. And for Mac users, it not Command C. So not the normal transition there. It really is your control button. One of the very few times you use it on a Mac. Into the list here. Where is it? Oh, yeah. I did half of the copy command. Add him to the list. And then, well, we saw in Linux, it was CP, so it was abbreviated. Windows for 2 letters isn't much of an abbreviation on 4 letters. So they actually went in and spelled out copy. Copy whatever file I just made, scratch.txt to duplicate.txt. And if we list out the things, which that's the way I tend to use PowerShell, is I mix and match Linux commands, and it's also customizable, like we're used to from languages. So if you try to type a command you're used to from Linux and it doesn't work, you can just automatically add it to PowerShell, or you can add it to PowerShell, create it and customize it. Little things like that, but just kind of getting started. And that's mostly what the assignment is. I think you're gonna make some folders, create some files, copy some files, delete some files. Oh, so if I list those out, see we have a bunch of them. Remove RM will remove things. So maybe remove scratch.txt.
So since you could type out copy, can you type out remove and it works?
Yes, the actual PowerShell one is remove item. It follows that nice naming convention with the dashes. And it's already gone from where I created it, but new item creates it, remove item, and we also have get item and set item. And y'all, by this point, y'all know what getters and setters do. So modern naming conventions, syntax is one of the nice things about PowerShell. So let's see if remove works. Remove scratch. Just remove doesn't work. The old command was abbreviated remove. Let me put something in that folder, cd scratch. And add a new item, add the junk.txt, and I don't think I need to put anything in it. Item type is a file, which isn't really necessary as the extension. So now there's something in that folder. If I go back up a level, dot refers to your current directory, and all of your terminals, dot will refer to your current directory. That way you don't have to try to type in the whole address, because those get really long sometimes, right? And dot, that's current directory and then parent directory. So you can go back up that way. You can't go more than 1 step at a time. So we need to go 2 steps. Like if I need to go all the way back up to say users folder, I have to go // to get to the delete, // to get up to documents. So you can only go 1 at a time before you need another slash, just like when you're going down the file path names. But dot is the current directory, dot is the parent directory. So that'll get you right back, move up a level, and all of them. That's consistent across all of them. Same thing in Linux. So if I tried to remove that now, if I go to remove scratch, it's not empty. So it asks about recursive. So we do have to do a recursive call. And notice if I push put the -r parameter. So I put the parameter name, but no arguments to fill that parameter. Anybody know what that parameter type is? So if we have numbers or words, we have to fill a parameter, right? But here I have function, parameter, and then argument for the next parameter, for the file parameter, not the -r parameter. The parameters that don't require anything are Booleans. So let me show that. So get help. There's help menus in all of them. Yeah, I'll do remove. So read our help manual here. That's probably the more useful thing to look at, right? How do we read the help instructions? Because obviously we don't have time in class to go over every single bit. So it's probably important to look at how to read the instructions. So overloading is allowed. We don't have overloading in Python, so that's something we won't have to worry about. We won't have to worry about overloading. If we need similar functions, we have to give them different names. But in PowerShell, we have overloading. And notice this first parameter here is path. And it's in square brackets. The dash, all the parameter names have a dash beside them. If you've noticed from what's showing here compared to what I've been typing, it is not case sensitive. And then that's followed by a string. So the path parameter takes in a string. And then this next one, filter. So if we need to do some sort of filtering, not gonna get into that this evening, but notice the parameter name and the type are surrounded by square brackets. And the difference there is this is a required parameter. And if name and type are both surrounded by the brackets, it's optional. So if we look through here, it looks like remove item, and the only thing that's required is the name of what we're removing. Everything else is going to be an optional parameter. Here's one with no, here's the -r, that one I just put in. The old one was -r, it's for recursive. So don't just delete that folder, loop through and delete everything in that folder so that it's all gone. That's why I went and deleted it the first time. If there's no type, that's a Boolean. And by default, they are false. So if you leave that parameter off, it's false. And if you include the parameter, it's true. So that's what that -r I just typed a moment ago was. So remove, which the Linux command looks exactly like that. Remove, RM for remove, -r for recursive, and then the name of the thing you want to remove, whether it's a file or a folder or anything. There's actually a special one for removing directories, but a file, you can just put RM file name, but a folder might have stuff in it, so you have to do remove, recursively remove. That fits better in English. So that's how you read those instructions. So parameter followed by type. And if the parameter is in square brackets and the type's outside of them, it's required. If both the parameter and type are included in the square brackets, it's optional. And if it's only a parameter, it's a Boolean. So write it if you want it to be true, leave it off if you want it to be false. And you can see they're overloading, so there's different ones. And as always, it's just like our functions, the order matters. So if you put it in the right order, you don't have to say the parameter names.
Hey, Chris, what do you mean by overloading?
Notice how there's two functions with the same name. It's that's what overloading is. We make multiple functions with the same name. So we don't have it here, but let me write one on the board. So let's say we're in Java. So Java, we have a Java function. We want to write a function to add two numbers, right? We make something public. Sorry, Java method, I'm in a classroom, right? When we're talking, we use those words interchangeably, but methods go with objects and functions go with procedural programming. And there's not really any procedural programming left in the world. It's all object oriented. So if they're all methods, I should use the technical terms. So we're going a method that adds numbers. So a public, well, if we're going to add a couple integers, we get back an integer, right? So it's going to return an integer. We'll call it add. And then when we set up the parameters for, that's why I went with Java, strictly types, we have to say what type it is. We'd say we'd have an integer called X and an integer called Y. Throw in our curly braces and return X plus Y. End of instruction. Finish out the curly brace, and that will add a couple of numbers, a couple of integers. What would happen if I tried to add a floating point number there?
It'll kick back an error because it's not
We can't
calculated.
It's the wrong type. So to do is, if we might have floating point numbers, actually we'd probably want 3 in this case. I don't know anything that we, let's say C#. Okay, let me go to C#. Because that first one can automatically say that that's exactly the same in Java and C#. So public float, add, maybe we pass in, they have an integer, want to add 2 and 3.14. So an integer and a floating point number. So int X and floating point number Y. And then we do the same thing. Return X plus Y, which if we add a whole number and a fractional number, we're going to get a fractional number back. And that's overloading. Whenever we call that, we'll just call the add function, and then we pass in 2 numbers to be added, and the computer will determine which one to run.
Okay, so it's to be on the safe side. So they're the same, but they have different float. And in this case, you've got they do the same thing, but depending on how the program is going to read the data, it could be a float or an integer, and that's when it'll decide which one to use.
Yes, because then there would be 2 more here. We could also have a float and then an integer. Could come in the other way, or we could have 2 floats. So it's not a safe side. We have to do that. If we're going to add 2 numbers and we don't know when we write the code what numbers the user is going to give us, we have to prepare for every situation. We can't do that in Python. Python is what's known as open typed. So we don't have to say what type it is. The computer figures out what type it is, which is one of the things that makes Python slower, because the computer has to waste time on that. Strictly typed languages are always faster because we already told the computer what type of data it has. It already set aside enough space in RAM to store 2 integers in that first example, or an integer and a float in the second example. But in Python, it just knows it needs 2 numbers. So it might set aside 128 bits for each one. And then if we pass in 2 4-bit numbers, or 2 numbers that could be held in 4 bits or 8 bits, if we could have used 1 byte instead of 228-bit numbers, we just wasted a whole bunch of RAM. So it's always faster, but that's one of the places Python gets slower. But we can't overload in Python. The people who make Python, there are built-in methods, overloaded methods in Python. So print is overloaded. Right, we can do multiple things with the print statement, right? I'm pulling up the documentation. Y'all have seen at least 2 of them, but let's look at the official documentation. Because overloading is a very important word. Overloading and overriding. Overriding is the most misused word in Hollywood. Override means change the default value. So next time you're watching a movie and the main character says they're going to try overriding something, Imagine that character saying, I'm going to try changing the default value. And it really makes what the Hollywood scriptwriters put together sound quite silly. But I guess it's a fancy sounding word, so they like to throw it in movies. But override means change the default value. Overloading, print in Python is overloaded. Oh, there it is. It went right to the tutorials. Like, oh, if you need print in Python, you need the most basic. That's the most basic tutorials. So in the input and output, we have multiple versions of print. Okay, so we can print formatted strings, print regular strings, well, they're just printing formatted strings. Comma separated strings. We have multiple types of formatting we can do. We put dot format at the end of it, or an F string, a B string. We'll see those before long because Python does not play well with other languages. You'll have probably heard the word Unicode before. The international standard of how we encode our characters. Python doesn't use that. So a Python string is not compatible with any other software outside of Python. So we might need to change that. Or comma separated, what version? I don't see a comma separated version. Y'all have seen that before, right? You print out a bunch of words and then you put commas, and then you can choose what goes in there as you can calculate the strings together. And that only works in the Python print statement. So I usually recommend against that in Classroom because that only works. And when you're printing to the console, which you're probably not going to be doing for very long, first couple assignments, then you're going to come up with a better place to print, like to a website or to a GUI or something. And then that comma separated will no longer work. So you might as well practice concatenation from the beginning. But we have lots of different versions of the print method. It's overloaded because they actually wrote that in C and then just generated the Python version from it. The Python version is a C wrapper, which the biggest drawback of Python is that it's really slow, right? Probably heard that over and over again. It's the slowest programming language, but that's because everything about Python is designed to be easier for the human. So one way we could get that back is it'd be nice to go to our fastest language, C family or C++, and you'll see something called C wrappers. And that's where we write Python code, but then when it runs, it automatically generates the C++ code and runs the C++ code. So we get the ease of writing in Python and the speed of C++ when we do it. But that is a very complex thing. So there's limited places we can do that. And even then it's hard to get all the way across the board. So like some sections will have C wrappers, but then some other code will be for Python. But still, it buys back time on the ones that we were able to change to the C family. Yeah, I guess that was mostly what I was going to look at here with these. So reading those instructions makes sense. Same thing in Linux. You can say, is it help? Oh. Man. Man is the manual. So you can just pull that up and go all the way through the whole Linux manual. Or like I did, it's on a different screen right now, but man space RM, and then here's the user manual for the remove function. Help is built into them. Q. Press H for help or Q to get. Oh, wait, there it goes. I thought I pressed Q. I must have pressed the wrong key. So same thing. Did I make a folder? Make directory scratch, and then move scratch. Yeah, scratch. I'll move scratch.txt into scratch folder. And MV is the move command in Linux. If you want to rename something, you move it to a different name. I'll put it in the scratch folder and rename it as junk.txt. Oops, gotta make a typo.
On scratch.
Oh. Do I have to put the whole directory name there? I might have to put the whole directory. So tilde is your home directory. That's the starting point. You can just use that as a shortcut, and then from there I went to documents /delete. And that.
The first scratch.
Oh. Thank you. I forgot they were. There we go. And that moved it from this one into that folder. So if we wanted to remove that folder with remove, we get that same, well, we get a different error message, but it means the same thing. Can't remove it. It's a folder. There's stuff inside it. If we remove recursively, then that'll delete the folder and everything inside it. Sort of a quick pass at it there. You'll do some stuff. You'll see the instructions. More is always acceptable in my class. That is something that will be very important for you as software developers. So if you want to take that further and do some more things with it, feel free. If you do so, when you submit it, please include in the comments like a list of the additions you made. Like, yeah, I also did this and this and this and this, so I know what to look for. But there's some of that. Like always, it's an active subject. You'll learn a lot more by doing it than me talking about it, but that was a quick pass at some of the stuff. Okay. I guess this is a good time to take a break. So, yeah, when I told the ethical hacking class if they want to stop by, one of the times I mentioned was right after break. I said 7:20, thinking it would be 7:10, but it's like I'm 5 minutes ahead this time. I was way behind earlier. It was like 40 minutes or 30 minutes behind where I planned to be in the afternoon class. It's hard to predict times when I'm sitting there at 5:30 in the morning thinking about what I'm going to talk about in class. But 5 minutes ahead this time, so 10 minutes sound good to everybody? And afterwards, we're going to talk about virtual environments, which is a very, very important thing if you're serious about software development. So my laptop says 7:05. We'll get back to it at 7:15. That's clock. Oh, and for those who weren't here at the beginning, some people from the ethical hacking class might join us for the useful module that I had planned for this week. Is also useful for people in the ethical hacking class, which is next door or on Zoom. So they might join us later this evening. But I'll see you all in a few minutes.